So I've titled the presentation "Cold Matters" because it's going to the bulk of the materials that I would like to share with everybody do relate to the more recent body of work that is emerges out of the framework of learning from ice. But what I wanted to begin with, Nicholas has already cited the beginning of the book Material Witness, but I wanted to actually move to the very end of that book because I thought that the context today was also an opportunity to revisit a couple of earlier projects that deal very directly with mining, and then shift from those projects to the works that deal very specifically with climate change evidence, if you will. There are obviously material connections and continuities between all the projects, but the end of the book starts to make an argument around what I call earth evidence. And in particular, it really looks at the mining operations of the Amarska mine in Prijedor, Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was a mine that was used as a concentration camp during the Balkan Wars, but then was acquired by ArcelorMittal, a global mining consortium, the owner of which, the CEO of which lives in the UK. This mine was acquired in 2004. At that time, there's still, bodies being discovered in mass graves throughout the region of Prijedor, and the local communities there, in particular, reached out to us when we were there with some collaborators called the Four Faces of Amarska and Grupa Spomenik, and they really asked us to see whether we could somehow work on this particular case. Here we have the International Commission for Missing Persons. This is a mass grave in the vicinity of the mining company. And the point is that during the war, the mine was used as I said, as a concentration camp, but also an extermination site, and bodies were disposed of using the infrastructure of the mining complex. And then after the war, the mine was sold to this, as I said, to ArcelorMittal Orbit, but many thousands of bodies have yet to be recovered. And the family members in particular have been prohibited from visiting the mine site, and both mourning the family members that they lost, but also have been engaged in a long-standing dispute because the families are convinced that the iron ore that is being extracted from the mine literally contains the material remains of their loved ones, of their family members. This came to a kind of point of intensification in London around the 2012 Olympics, where the company claimed that the symbolic quantities of steel were going to be acquired from all of their mining operations throughout the world, including Amarska, and would then be forged into this tower here, a tower designed by Anish Kapoor. And so the fact of the Olympics in London, the disaffected community in Prijedor, and the sort of material continuities established by iron ore, enabled us, meaning the students in forensic architecture and the Center for Research Architecture together to work on this case. And we, in effect, we reclaimed this contorted sculpture here called the Orbit, the Amarska Memorial kind of in exile. And it was an act of reclaiming, as I said, that was made possible by the material continuities that really allowed us to forge a connection between very disparate kind of geographies. So the end of the book really starts to explore these kinds of cases in which the evidence isn't media in the kind of conventional sense that the rest of the cases in the book deal with, because those cases were largely focused on the ways in which video, photography, sound files, etc. We're carrying extraneous information and then unfolding the kind of politics of those media artifacts. Towards the end of the book, I'm really trying to think of media much more expansively and really think about the earth itself as a kind of geomediological kind of entity that's, what others have argued are like a techno kind of fossil, if you will. And so some of the activities and cases that I explore were things like this, this in particular. And as I mentioned, there's still 1,000 people that have whose bodies have yet to be recovered that were known to have disappeared in the Amarska mine. So here we have a very literal sense of a material witness. That being said, so yes, a very literal sense of a material witness. The material meaning the sort of the iron ore, which is now, it was called limonite in there, that is somehow also a carrier of other kinds of matter, including biological kind of life. Of course, it's, soil, etc. The geological record is always a carrier of many of the remains of human activities and otherwise, and that's certainly also one of the major arguments around the sort of Anthropocene. But that's one of the earlier projects that I worked on that dealt with the politics of extractivism very kind of directly in relationship to affected communities. Another project is the Trace Evidence Project, which is a trilogy that looks at 3 events around nuclear energy and tries to tell a story in relationship to evidence that both evidence from, say, Fukushima, Daiichi, Chernobyl, but also Oklo in Gabon, and looks at 3 cases in which there's a form of evidence emerges around the nuclear, and the nuclear in my book also becomes a very significant entity to investigate, precisely because of the way of its incredible kind of latency, the ways in which nuclear contaminants, may take decades, centuries. The timescales of the nuclear are such that they really trouble accountability regimes. When you think about the ways in which cancer cells might metastasize, sometimes that can take a very long time to come to the fore, and this condition of latency between an environmental, say, accident, or the condition of latency between an event and its effect, we really see how that then becomes crucial within the context of climate justice campaigns. So we have latency, the kind of extended time scales, oftentimes the highly kind of distributed nature of these environmental events, the fact that they can also be very dynamic, nonlinear in terms of the behavior of contaminants and pollutants, et cetera. So in the Earth Evidence part of the book, I'm really starting to look at the ways in which these kinds of accidents, events, disasters, crimes, and violations, if the ways in which they really trouble the kind of typical ways in which the legal system would want to find a perpetrator for a crime. They troubled what is called direct causality. So in criminal law, one needs to prove that A caused B. You need to establish a direct causal link within to achieve a criminal finding of criminal responsibility. You can fine an oil and gas company for negligence, and they may have to pay compensatory damages, but it would be very difficult to find an oil and gas company criminally responsible for an event. And that is because one needs to prove that this oil spill here caused these sort of these adverse health effects in a community, say downriver or downstream. So we have the burden of direct causality that has really hampered a lot of environmental justice campaigns, and it's also why there's been a call for different kinds of forms of illegal, different legal mechanisms to emerge. So an international crimes tribunal, for example, or we've seen the emergence of non-legal forums, and this will really take me to my kind of current work. But just suffice to say that these earlier projects that dealt with mining really tried to investigate these conditions of, as I said, latency, highly dynamic nonlinear systems, all of the ways in which the behavior of pollutants and contaminants have really hampered environmental justice campaigns. So that's a little bit of a kind of preamble that will then take me into the more current work around ice. I'd like to play just a short clip from the first chapter of this trace evidence trilogy, which was called Geology.
Uranium mining continued throughout southeastern Gabon until 1999, when the economic viability of extraction shifted. Oklo's deposits only lasted until 1985, after which time its waste rock was left to languish. Futile efforts to curtail uranium dust and the extensive leaching of contaminants from the region's many tailing ponds led to the damming of the Matembe River. Trace evidence of its ancient nuclear legacy has since reappeared, but not as a dangerous latency attributable to the cosmic alchemy of early Earth, but rather to that of industrial mining practices.
For 40 years, Comuf, a subsidiary of the French nuclear giant Areva, mined uranium in southern Gabon. The operation has had serious consequences for the health of the workers and locals. Many former miners, both Gabonese and French, have died of lung cancer. Under pressure from NGOs, Areva opened a medical clinic last October, but the staff here don't all have the training or resources to properly diagnose diseases linked to uranium mining.
Ça fait plus de 30 ans. Plus de 30 ans qu'on a ce problème.
Ça fait longtemps, depuis que Comuf existait.
A legacy of colonialism and unnatural resource extraction expressed within the damaged ecosystems of the region and the cellular defects of mine workers and local inhabitants. At Oklo, a lethal archive once etched into its ancient geology now re-emerges within the biopolitical strata of matter.
Cette carrière aujourd'hui, elle est remplie d'eau. Et lorsqu'on a démantelé l'ancienne usine de la nouvelle, tous les déchets ont été rejetés. Donc tout ce qui a servi à la construction de l'usine, les fers, les engins de mine, tout a été jeté à l'intérieur de cette carrière.
Tous les déchets venant des usines. Tous les travaux de la digue ont duré au moins 2 ou 3 ans, parce que c'est bien avant la fermeture de l'usine qu'on a fait ça. C'était pour faire disparaître les traces
So in that little clip, you see a lot of these, you see the ways in which the politics of evidence is really challenged by the operations of these large extractivist infrastructures. In this next clip that I want to share from atmospheric feedback loops, there's a bit of a shift that takes place. This was a commission to produce a 35mm vertical film. And I'll just play a short excerpt that comes from the very end. I'm still engaging with the question of evidence with this project, but really starting to look at things that are called in the world of climate science, data proxies. So these are the ways in which we might find evidence for environmental change, but prior to the invention of instruments of measure. So data proxies typically are things like tree rings, ice cores, and ice cores, of course, will become a major kind of area of occupation in my work as I return back to the cryospheric environments like the Arctic, originally from Canada, and the projects that I then will produce after this really take me directly back into those kinds of cryospheric contexts. But in atmospheric feedback loops, I worked with a group of climate scientists in the Netherlands, and one of the things that they were doing was also looking at the sort of art historical bounty, if you will, of paintings that have been produced, so Dutch landscape paintings. And the scientists were using these paintings to understand something of the atmospheric conditions that they were trying to study through their contemporary instrumentation. And here we have the kind of a very, very tall tower that is has all kinds of technical instruments attached to it that's trying to understand and measure and monitor atmospheric changes and climatic systems, as well as more localized weather systems. But these scientists we're starting to look at the legacy of Dutch landscape painting precisely to understand something of the region's climatic histories prior to the invention of measurements. And so, of course, these kinds of data proxies can also include things like cultural materials. So farmers and almanacs would be another kind of example. So in as much as ocean sediments, cores from coral reefs, which are there's a lot of that happening both in particular off the west coast of Australia. These kinds of data proxies are utilized to enable scientists to build the global climate model, but acquire different forms of material evidence, as I said, that predate the invention of instruments of monitoring and measurement. So let me play a little clip from the very ending of this 35mm film.
A story is repeated here at Cabau. The artist Joseph Beuys once theorized that the unique atmospheric properties of light, which had inspired Dutch painters since the 17th century, had disappeared with the land reclamation projects of the 1950s. As post-war modernization began its terraforming operations throughout coastal regions of the Netherlands, the air was said to have lost its refractive shimmer due to the diminished number of water molecules carried inland by prevailing winds.
We use a painting from the 17th century landscape painter Jacob van Ruysdael. In fact, this is what he painted, the Dutch skies. Well, without knowing it, he recorded all the complex things about atmospheric research that we're studying.
The scientists conducting research here are recording even more dramatic changes as atmospheric feedback loops between land, sea, and air reveal long-term amplification of climate change signals. Terrestrial, aquatic, and atmospheric mediums have been forcefully remixed, creating radical new forms of unnatural media.
So with some of those short samples and comments, we have I've tried to introduce briefly, as did Nicholas, the idea of the material witness. So entities that harbor evidence of external events, but also provide some insight into the ways in which those materials might become significant or consequential. The notion of earth evidence, the data proxy, and in this last that last clip from atmospheric feedback loops, we also have a sense of the kind of technicity of environmental, what for me would be environmental media. And certainly the scientists that I was working with, they would consider clouds as producing a data set. And they're also, they would say, we're trying to extract the signal from the noise, meaning also the atmospheric interference is a kind of noise out of which they're trying to extract the very specific kind of climate signal. So the languages that contemporary climate scientists speak and say contemporary artists speak are often very similar, and the tools of data visualization, et cetera, would also be shared. So there's actually a lot of, I think, convergence, both in terms of language, modes of investigation, forms of visualization. So there's also a kind of aesthetic convergence that takes place. Learning from ice began with a documentary about ice cores. And here we have an example of an ice core that's been starting to be kind of worked on. So we can see the ways in which it's been cut, but also, of course, there's an arrow indicating the direction, because this is really important, because what an ice core is a vertical column of ice that is extracted from the ice sheets. These typically are from Greenland and Antarctica. So those would be the major ice coring sites where one can go back 800,000 years into the past and extract meter-long sections of ice. So the ice core comes out of the origins. Once again, it has a relationship to extractivism, because in 1955, American miners in Greenland started to use mining and drill technology to extract ice. And these meter-long sections of ice were brought up in preparation for the International Geophysical Year of 1957. So ice coring itself is a practice that comes directly out of the history of mining. And the extrusion of these vertical columns includes a very detailed, that is to say, high resolution data set of climatic change, specifically atmospheric changes. And so anything that goes into the atmosphere will eventually be deposited on the world's ice sheets. So that is to say, atmospheric matter is globally circulated. It takes about a year, but something that might happen in the Gobi Desert, particulate matter that is thrown into the air from the Gobi Desert can make its way into Antarctica within a year. And so because every layer of snowfall is in effect a layer, an archival layer. All of this material that goes into the Earth's atmosphere shows up in the ice core records, and that allows climate scientists to really go back in time and to look at the ways in which the climate has been changing. But in particular, the most important thing about an ice core is that it contains captured bubbles of air. So it contains, in particular, methane and CO2. So the ice compresses air, and in compressing air, what we have, although the scientists call this a data proxy, I would say this is a direct material witness, because we have the material itself from hundreds of thousands of years, of like 800,000 years ago. We have the compressed air from the planet's early atmospheric chemistry, and this is why the ice core is so crucial to telling the story of greenhouse gas emissions, because it's basically harboring incontrovertible evidence. This is the actual material residue. And so it's very hard to dispute the findings that are archived in a ice core. And so the documentary begins in my case, the documentary begins actually in the Canadian Ice Core Archive, which contains the data set from the high Arctic in Canada. And it's the largest ice core collection of Arctic ice. And that is at the University of Alberta in Western Canada. And I had the good fortune to be able to spend a couple of weeks with the scientists there, documenting the activities of the ice core archive. But in particular, I really also wanted to focus on the labor practices of the scientists. I'll play a couple of clips from this project, because that will then take me to my recent work from this sort of past year. But let me take you into the Canadian Ice Core Archive now. The Canadian Ice Core Archive, now at the University of Alberta, shelters this unique collection of historic ice. Cores from Mount Logan in the Yukon, as well as from the Arctic archipelago, including the Penny Ice Cap on Baffin Island, the Prince of Wales Ice Field and Agassiz Ice Cap both on Ellesmere Island, and the Devon Ice Cap on Devon Island, are all preserved within these cylindrical tubes. And I'll play one more clip further into the project. Climate-controlled environments are energy-intensive. From the conditioning of air, the refrigeration that feeds cold supply chains, to the thermostatic extremes that safeguard precious samples of ice.
The production of artificial cold requires a vast infrastructure of compressors, coolants, coils, fans, and most importantly, fuel. The processing of data and storage of information, too, requires intensive cooling systems. While cold has a natural history, artificial cold had to be invented. Although the survival of ice cores is also reliant upon cold, sustaining our icy infrastructures globally has come at the considerable cost of warming our planet.
I wanted to play that second clip in particular because when I was working on the ice core project, I also really started to think about the production of artificial cold. And as I mentioned in that clip, to really think about things like the like the cold supply chains, et cetera, et cetera. So really thinking about the ways in which cold, and in particular, like cold temperature, is can also be a kind of register of can also function as a kind of evidential agent in you, if you will. And this took me to a series of works that I call cold cases that are on exhibit now. And these are a bit of a departure because they deal very directly with the politics of cold. They're part of the Learning from Ice project, but that project was by and large, and it continues, is really organized around the ways in which ice is a mediator of different knowledge practices. And if I have time, I'll play like a 1-minute clip from the Listening to Ice, which is a recent research project that is ongoing with collaborators in India. But the cold cases is a sort of branch of this sort of larger research project that investigates human rights violations, in particular to the thermostatic extremes of cold. And it was an opportunity for me to work with forensic architecture again and produce a series of investigative files that I called cold cases. At present, I produced three cases that look at the weaponization of temperature, and then a fourth video called Cold Rights. I have a few notes that I'd like to read in relationship to these materials, and that will help me manage time as well, I hope. So let me just go through this. So you've seen that, so the cold cases, through the analysis of a series of contemporary as well as historic cold cases, I've set out to explore the strategic role of temperature and speculate about the emergence of a new thermopolitics defined by cold. Each of the documentaries I produced exposes the degree to which temperature is a register of violence that includes the legacies of climate colonialism, longstanding socioeconomic inequalities, and ongoing structural racism. Moreover, the response of authorities and police to many of the cases discussed in the project has been willfully negligent and largely indifferent. Accountability for their acts of hypothermic harm remains painfully elusive. The dual meaning of the term cold case invoked by the project's title thus refers both to events of temperature-induced violence, but also to police files that are no longer under active investigation. Exploring the politics of cold through these cases invites viewers to reflect upon an ethics of temperature guided by conception of cold rights, and by extension, the evidential valence of cold as it both interacts with and is instrumentalized by institutions, bodies, materials, and environments. Now I'll play a clip from the first case called Freezing Deaths, which takes us to the western city of Saskatoon in Canada. In June 2003, Russell Sabo, chief of the Saskatoon Police Service, admits that an officer was disciplined in 1976 for abandoning a woman who was 8 months pregnant on the outskirts of the city. During the night, 3 people, all First Nations, were taken into custody by Constable Ken King and driven to an isolated area. There they were dropped off and forced to walk back in cold nighttime temperatures. King reportedly drove them outside the city limits as punishment for having liquor in a place other than a dwelling, rather than lay charges. Paperwork would have necessitated bringing the 3 people into police facilities, where they would have spent the remainder of the night. King was eventually charged with discreditable conduct and neglect of duty, charges he repudiated. On October 15th, Constable King was fined $200. This clandestine practice is known as taking someone on a starlight tour, a shadow system of racist policing in Canada aimed at evading the justice system, one that would repeat itself over decades to come. The following cases map a pattern of abuse in which temperature, in particular cold, would come to play a strategic role in the violence perpetrated against Indigenous bodies. As each case unfolds, we track the journey taken through the city using historic temperature data, which is synced along the route. The point of interception by police and subsequent abandonment of those taken into custody, usually in remote areas of the city, is also highlighted. As daytime temperatures drop under the cover of darkness, wind chill and precipitation would combine with often deadly consequences. The timeline we created expands and contracts, focusing on minute details leading up to the period when people were apprehended by police, threatened, abused, and eventually deserted or even left to die. It also maps the denial and delay of institutional responses to the practice of starlight tours, in which years of indifference would rarely see any form of justice done. Cold cases, which are, in effect, climate crimes. When racialized people, especially First Nations, come into the custodial care of authorities, police, prisons, and schools, harm, abuse, and violence is a frequent outcome. Admission to freezing deaths and abandonment as an informal operation of policing has been vigorously denied, and disciplinary action and accountability remains infrequent and is at best significantly delayed. Yet the pattern and practice of starlight tours has unfolded across cities and rural communities in Canada for decades. When authorities were forced to confront the outcomes of inquiries and commissions, denial and indifference on the part of those implicated was the norm. Dropping temperatures and environmental conditions became lethal weapons and tools of force for managing and abusing racialized people. Yet findings of exposure and hypothermia in autopsy reports could not prove that the weather was used deliberately on the part of those authorities who took people into their custody, nor indeed would any coroner's inquest establish the actual cause of death, namely structural racism and settler colonialism. No death certificate will ever disclose the real reasons that Neil Stonechild, Frank Joseph Paul, Lloyd Joseph Dustyhorn, Rodney Nastis, and Lawrence Kim Wagner perished, nor the hundreds of others who've disappeared or died through willful neglect and abandonment. I have a couple more clips that I'd like to show, but I might not have enough time. But let me just try and move through some other examples in relationship to these cases. On the 27th of October 2016, hundreds of law enforcement officers descended upon the Ocheri-Shikon 1851 treaty camp just north of the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation to disband its Indigenous activists, international observers, and allies. This camp stood in the immediate path of the Dakota Access Pipeline and was the site of much direct action and resistance. A day after the October raid, police installed a military-style blockade, chaining burned-out trucks to concrete barricades on the highway just north of the frontline camp, hampering access to the site as well as obstructing potential exit routes. On November 18th, the Morton County Sheriff released a cold weather warning detailing the many consequences of exposure to the elements. It was specifically directed towards water protectors and other protesters involved in the No DAPL movement. Here we go. 2 days later, despite sub-zero temperatures and a wind chill of 14 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 10 Celsius, the Morton County Sheriff began a 12-hour assault against water protectors at Backwater Bridge. The assault involved the use of tear gas, concussion grenades, less lethal shotgun rounds, and in particular, the use of water, drenching protesters throughout the night. As core temperature of bodies fell into the danger zone, the campfires that were being used to generate warmth were also targeted by police. Over 200 peaceful protesters were injured that night, 26 needing immediate hospitalization. Over 300 cases of hypothermia were reported. I'm going to, I'd like to manage my time just so we have enough for Q&A, but just to say that this is here we can see a little bit of the ways in which we model, the forensic architecture and I actually modeled what happened that night, syncing up all of the different social media, like phone videos that were produced on the scene. So we were able to produce a relatively sort of comprehensive model that enabled us to prove that that there were 72 instances of the water hose being directed deliberately against protesters, which completely contradicts the account of the authorities. So this case, weaponizing water against water protectors, takes place in 2016. And the other cold case that is part of this particular kind of trilogy deals with icebox detention along the US-Mexico border, where we modeled a typical holding cell inside one of these temporary detention centers that are run by Customs and Border Protection in the United States. And there's lots of witness statements by detainees, all of whom stress the degree to which these holding cells are extremely cold. And as this person says here, we were completely soaked from crossing the river. We waded in the water up to our waist. The place they held us was really cold. They only gave us a paper blanket. That's all we had to keep us warm. We were sitting on the cement floor, completely freezing. In the end, I had to sleep seated upright with my son in my lap because I couldn't let him lay down on the cement floor. He would have been much too cold. So CBP detention, with this final cold case, what we have is we have temperature that is legally inscribed into the policy of detention and imprisonment in the United States. So there's a transition from the kind of clandestine practices that are being used in Canada, in which cold is used in effect, secretly by the police as part of the kind of tactics of policing, in particular Indigenous peoples and communities, Indigenous bodies, to the use of water as part of a kind of tactical response to crowd control at Standing Rock, to the eventual use of the thermostat and turning down the temperature by guards in the CPP detention facility. So we really see this transition of cold being used. We see both a pattern of abuse, but we also see the ways in which cold is moving from something that is done, as I said, clandestinely, to actually the legal oversight of temperature across the three cases. And the final point I'd like to make, if I may, is I wanted to just, and I apologize for maybe not managing my time as well as I would have liked, but I did want to raise a point about temperature ethics in relationship to the discussion, I think, and the ways in which I'm trying to move away from legal frameworks to thinking about sort of what could be contexts for thinking about justice rather than thinking about legal questions. And so let me read this sort of final paragraph here. Oops, sorry about that. If I can move back. Today, the consequences of changing temperature are, of course, central to the climate crisis. So it may seem somewhat surprising that little public attention has been paid to the ways in which temperature has been used to inflict harm in other circumstances. Cold, in particular, rarely features in general discussions of climate change, except by climate deniers, nor in debates around civilian policing. Yet even when medium forums focus on the cryosphere or frozen geographies of our planet, the emphasis is primarily on warming resulting from greenhouse gas emissions. These are discussions in which anthropogenic activities are demonstrably causal with respect to how rising temperatures are responsible for glacial recession, sea ice retreat, and the fracturing of the polar ice sheets. And while the impacts of such dramatic material changes have direct consequences for all planetary life forms, few considerations reflect upon the ways that thermal properties of environmental systems are enlisted as indirect weapons against people, although there are endless examples in which we have simply let so-called compromised nature run its course, with devastating effect on human as well as more than human ecologies. For affected communities in the North who've been dealing with the ravages of global warming, especially Indigenous people, the right to be cold has become a potent political demand that underscores our very inseparability from the environments in which we are all enfolded. And although this legal petition was dismissed by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 2005, when Inuk activist Sheila Kluche first filed a petition on behalf of herself and 62 Inuit people living in the Arctic regions of Canada and the US, the transformation of a thermostatic condition into an ethical claim for cold rights has never been more urgent. Cold politics demands an engagement with a climactic sense of justice, rather than a partitioning of rights to states and treaty signatories. The right to be cold is not a call to be subjected to harsh or inhospitable conditions, but is a provocation which recognizes that the material integrity of environments upon which cryospheric communities depend are thermostatically interdependent. It is thus a plea for an ethics of temperature that is relational and committed to It is thus a plea for an ethics of temperature that is relational and committed to a life's flourishing, the right to exist within a stable temperature regime that sustains rather than destroys life worlds. I have a 1-minute clip. I realize I've gone slightly over time, but it's a 1-minute compilation from the work that we're doing in India. And it just has some music that I put on top of it from but I'd like to just play that to give people a sense of the more kind of collaborative work that I've been doing with the scientists and grassroots organizations in the Zanskar region. So that's 1 minute, and then I'll end there.